Just to make it a bit easier, I have a prized copy of the book to give away for those of you who are listening all the way through, but we'll see where. I'm also going to talk a little bit about feeling like an imposter as a children's author, but we'll come to that a bit later. So the topic I've given myself, which is always the worst way to do a presentation, because I know, why did I pick this topic, is about writing to give children power and how to do that and why it matters. And actually, even though I do have a prize to keep you awake till the end, this was a copy. If there's anything that you take away from my presentation today, and hopefully that frames the remainder of this incredible conference, it's to know this, which I learned, which I would want all of us in this room to remember, which is that you have power. And sometimes it can feel like we don't, but you have power. We have power. Each of us does. And when I talk to children in my books and in the keynotes that I give in the work I do in the advertising world, is that everyone has power. And that power comes because there is only one of us. And you'll see I've used the fingerprint. And I talk to children, and I want us to consider the idea that when you hear someone's voice, you know exactly who that person is, just by the tenor of their voice. You can tell who they are, and that is the unique identifier each of us has. And that means that each of us also has a unique voice to contribute into the world, and that is part of the power that we have. Now, power comes from understanding the world. That's really been my quest in the work that I do across all the different creative economy sectors. It comes from forming our own opinion. It comes from building our ecosystems, which I'm going to talk about later. But most of all, that power, that voice, that unique fingerprint comes from knowing our own story and how it fits in with the wider world around us. So let me tell you a little bit about my story so you can get to know who I am and why I think we should be sharing our voices and finding that power in the stories we each have. Let me tell you one little anecdote. This is from the World Cup in 2018. This is before Women's World Cup became a big thing and before England got to the final. By the way, am I holding those two phones? Two phones. You can hear me. My husband says I talk quite loudly at the lot, so sorry. In 2018, I have two daughters who are currently 12 and 18, and they've provided a lot of the inspiration of the work that I do. Actually, they're the reason that I got into children's writing in the first place, so you can blame them, sorry. And I was chatting to the then 7-year-old, and she said, "Mummy, why is the World Cup," because this was the Men's World Cup, "the one that everyone actually watches with the boys and not the girls?" And I was thinking, good spot, daughter. Well done. Feminism 101. Glad to see that it's paying off. And I just tweeted out that, that I was proud of her, that she was observant of what was happening in the world and that we were having this conversation. The responses I got to a very simple mum anecdote, and I'm sorry, I'm going to show you this, but it's the kind of way that I want to frame up the conversation of power, voice, and story, was this. She should be halftime entertainment in the National Stadium. And that was my 7-year-old daughter. And I spent some time thinking about what was a very anodyne anecdote. I'm sure I wasn't the only mum in the world having a chat with their daughters about the World Cup and football. I don't like football, by the way, just so you know. So it was kind of like, I want more women to play football, but I don't have that much interest in football, just so you know. And I thought about who gets to own my story. Why can't I tell my story about me and my daughter, my family, my perspective on the world, without having that very aggressive, violent, dehumanizing pushback? Is it because I was a woman that I couldn't have the right to my own story? Was it because I'm a person of colour, I'm of South Asian heritage, a Muslim woman? In fact, you could put any adjective that you want there. The right to have my own story. But what does that right mean? It's about being seen as who I am, as a human being, to see myself, to be part of the norm and not the abnorm, to have my story told, but most of all, to be able to tell my story myself. That's what that right meant to me when I was thinking about that reaction. Just like anyone else, not an other woman. This is a snapshot of a range of front pages over the recent years. There's probably an update that could be done to this about the front pages about Muslims like in the UK. And what that tells me when we put that together is that the stories that are told matter. The stories that are told matter. And when I look at that, and I have those discussions in society, the work I do in the various industries, people say, well, if that's what's happening, you should lean in. They say, put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to complain, you need to do something about it. They say you need to change the system from the inside. Do you know what? I've started to do all of those things. So, I started to write my first book, Love in a Headscarf, which is a memoir about being a Muslim woman. Humorous, funny, irreverent, translated into 13 languages, award-winning. Couldn't get publisher to publish it for the first year because they thought no one would buy the story and they couldn't see how a positive story of a Muslim woman could exist. Went on to write another one, Generation M, about young Muslim identity, had my 2 girls, and then I thought, it's much easier to persuade children to see the world in a different way than it is adults, so I started writing for children. I also started writing news and opinion, newspapers, op-eds, podcasting, different side of the cultural discussion. And I went into advertising, which is maybe a story for a different day, about the way advertising affects our culture and how we see the world. And actually, in a world where we trust politicians and journalists less and less, actually the commercial space and branding is a very interesting place for us to change our culture. And as you can see, those are all sources of power, places that we can tell different stories. Now, in the UK, we often talk about the class system and social mobility, but actually people are starting to talk about how the class system no longer works for us as a country. It doesn't represent who we are. And actually that there are different sources of power and different sources of social mobility. And people have been talking about economic, social, and cultural capital. Economic capital, obviously how much money you make, income, and wealth. But I want us to think about social and cultural capital as forms of power. Social capital are the people you know, the networks you have, the connections you make. And we can teach ourselves, and we can teach and show children how they can create those connections. I joked at the beginning about feeling imposter syndrome, but part of it is being able to get out of where you're comfortable or feel restricted into places where the conversations are having. But most of all, I think for all of us in this room, and certainly for me, it's about how do we create cultural capital? Because those newspaper front pages that I showed you, and I'm not the only one, I'm not just as a Muslim, you can see those happening about all sorts of different groups that do not have cultural capital. Because cultural capital is the right to determine your own story. Who tells your story, what they say about it, and the kind of capital you have in order to achieve the rights and opportunities that you want in society. So we have the power for ourselves. Everyone in this room has cultural capital and can exercise it, and we can give that cultural capital to children. And my thesis here is that we can do that by helping children to understand what their story is and how they advocate for that story in our society. And by advocating their own story, having known it, how to have really powerful conversations with other people. And it's those conversations that make the difference. So it's not that the stories that are told simply matter, it's the stories that we tell. That is our power. The stories we tell matter. So which brings me to this chap, which you might recognise from a very passionate day in 2020. This is Edward Colston, or the statue of Edward Colston, rather than the man himself, the statue and the myth. And my 2 daughters, as I mentioned to you, have been a huge inspiration in writing for children. They love horrible histories. They know everything there is to know about history. And one of the really interesting, or maybe uninteresting things about me, is that actually I finished studying history in year 9. So So I learned a bit about the Stone Age, a little bit about the Russian Revolution. I think I did a little bit about the French Revolution, and that was it. Nobody ever told me anything about anything. So I have come to writing Story of Now about the British Empire, not as somebody who is a historian, and not, you can tell me otherwise later, I don't even feel like I'm a proper children's author. Although having been Carnegie nominated, I'm like, no, jury's still out on that one. But what I'm really interested in is, who are we? What makes us who we are? So my memoir about growing up as a Muslim woman, working in advertising, thinking about news and opinion, is who are we? What makes us who we are? And that's why when I came to write Story of Now, it wasn't to be a history book. You need to know history, of course you do. You need to know the framing of the past in order to work out what today means and what we do for the future. But when I looked at Edward Colston, and I say this in the book to you, I'd never heard of him. And to be honest, I think probably most people hadn't. So I wanted to have a conversation with my extremely deeply knowledgeable historian children about what was happening in the world. And in 2020, there were almost no books about the British Empire. And I just cannot emphasize how completely nuts, that's a technical word, how completely nuts that is. Because the British Empire, as a matter of fact, was the biggest empire ever in history. I mean, literally the biggest empire ever in history. Bigger than the Greeks, bigger than the Romans. I don't know about you, my children bring home endless books. We've got Greek Day coming up there, so if you have costume tips, please let me know. And this was just something that I found absolutely extraordinary. But then I was thinking about Edward Colston, and if you want to know about his complex history in British culture, you can read that. They're selling copies, by the way. But I was also thinking about this. I live in northwest London, and this is part of the promotion that we used for the book. What was in Wembley before Wembley Stadium? Intriguing. Do you guys recognise this? Oh, there's some, you guys are too clever. There's like nodding.
It's the Empire Stadium thing.
That's right. It's the British Empire exhibition, yes, which has its 100th anniversary next year. And was built about 100 years ago, sorry, that's just repeating what I just said, to celebrate and to kind of rah-rah the population about this incredible thing called the British Empire. This doesn't exist anymore, and nobody batted an eyelid when it was completely demolished, because today we have Wembley Stadium with a big arch there. Because the Empire exhibition. But when Colston fell, there was this huge outcry about his statue falling. This, if you ever go along the A40 further up from Wembley, I don't know how familiar you guys are with London, when they demolished the British Empire exhibition and they wanted to rebuild Wembley Stadium, they had to dig up all the earth, and they transported all the earth to this area just along the A40 called North Harlow Fields. Nobody talks about what a disaster that was. Was it an insult to the British Empire that the Empire Festival and the Empire Exhibition was destroyed? Which made me think, why do some stories matter more than others? What happens when your story is missing from that conversation? Who is the conversation for? How do we have great conversations? And for me, that led to posing the question to children, and all of us, secretly I do want all the adults to read the book as well. How do you make sure that you are in the story of now? And that's why we use the strapline. This is not a history book. Because as those two examples show, history is in plain sight. It shapes all of our conversations and our societies of who we are. So here was the question. What do you really know about the British Empire? I hope you've been swatting up before this. This is where the prize comes in for good answers. So, when did the British Empire start? 17th. More specific? Oh, East India Company. Any other suggestions?
1652 in South Africa.
My editor's putting it, you're not allowed to. You'll get to say something later. Well, I think if nothing else, the fact that we have such a wide variety of answers is itself rather telling. It's kind of a bit of a trick question as well, because even if you say there was a start, it was neither British nor an empire when it started. I'll show you the answers in a minute. So far, nobody is winning this book, just to let you know. How old is Britain as a country? Don't worry, I'm not gonna shock you to the British values people. Oh, that is somebody who knows their stuff. Anyone want to shout a date out? I heard it's 1700 something. 1707. We have a winner. Thank you very much. Act of Union. Thank you. You might be on for the book. Just sit tight. When did it become an empire? I'm enjoying the fact that we're talking about Britain and the British Empire, and I'm going to say this politely. You guys are basically as clueless as I was when I started. We have the Empress of India, and then, do you know the date? Okay, we're kind of, I can't tear the book in half, at the moment it's a bit like a net. And when did the British Empire end? Love that as a first answer. Okay, how do you feel about how much you didn't know? I might have to say that at 10:30 in the morning. So, well, when did the British Empire start? Well, some people say it was when Henry VIII declared England, the realm of England as an empire. Some people say 1533, some people say 1532. Some people say, well, actually, the empire really began when England started its devastation in Ireland and wanted to occupy that. Or there is no official start date, because it was neither Britain nor an empire when it started. So, take from that what you will. How old is Britain as a country? We did have a winning answer of 1707, thank you very much, of the Act of Union. When did it become an empire? Well, some people say when we had the first colony in North America, 1607, Jamestown. Bit of a dodgy story behind that one. Or we did have an answer from when Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India, which was 1877, which was a rather nice story because she couldn't declare, she wanted to be an empress like her other imperial peers across Europe, but of course you can't declare yourself an emperor or empress in Britain because that would not go down well. So they kind of concocted this idea that she'd be the Empress of India so she could get the title. And did it end? I have to say, I like the idea of has it ended because we still have a Commonwealth. Some people might say 1997, which I point out to children in their book. I was alive, so it's not that long ago. I'm not sure who the winner was for that. I think the most specific answer is the lady here with the 1707. There were some good other answers. So there you go. Thank you. But the books are available to buy on an absolute deal. So, which brings me to talk about the book itself, and actually the power of stories and who gets to tell them. Don't you absolutely love these the visualization of it? I'll talk about that in a minute. So, one of the things that was really important to me, writing a book for children, and looking at the gap and the scant information that we had about telling our stories, was that a lot of stories about the British Empire and Britain are written for adults and then simplified and rewritten for children. And that's absolutely not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was to stand in the shoes of children and see the world in the way that those children see it. Edward Colston is just such a great example of the culture wars that have taken over the conversations that we want to have with our children and the way that we want to hopefully get them to see the world in a more positive, constructive way. And so one of the things that was really important to me in the book was that we should pack it with as many stories of children so that children reading it could see themselves in those stories and could see how they draw power from those stories in the way that they conduct their lives. So this is, of course, as you know, Orlando Equiano, who wrote probably the first memoir that went on to become a bestseller about the actual experience of being an enslaved person. And that was a part of the radical transformation of the abolitionist movement. And so I asked children, how can telling your own story be a superpower? Because that's exactly what this story did. When somebody was able to articulate what happened to them, it totally transformed the way people understood the human experience of being enslaved. You know, I talk to children in the book about the Industrial Revolution, how it's connected to the empire. There's often a disconnect, the idea there was something happening in the colonies and then Britain had this supposed rising tide, but actually things were pretty tough in Britain for people who were outside of those wealthy business, entrepreneurial, ruling elites. And so I talk to children about the Industrial Revolution, this is one of the photos in the book, and actually quoting the words of children like them. And I know sometimes it can be difficult to present children with those difficult raw testimony, but the children said it, and our children, in my view, deserve to be able to read it and assess it for themselves. But also, that these stories that the children were so brave to share with the commissions about the poor working conditions of children during the Industrial Revolution, led to the reform of the labour laws. And children today who get to go to school and not have to work can thank those children. And again, that's something so important I wanted to convey to children today, that they have power. When they speak up, they can change things for themselves and for the future. The Match Girl strike, again, 13, 14-year-old girls working in terrible, terrible conditions, 13, 14, 16 hours a day, often with their pay being docked because they had committed some egregious contravention of the rules, developing phossy jaw and getting cancer of their jaw from phosphorus. But what is so powerful in my view for children, when you look at this photo and you see the faces of the girls, that are like the teenage girls that I'm hoping are reading this book, they organised protest, and that changed not just their condition, but the condition of the dock workers who were probably part of their extended families, and that went on to form the labour movement. And I think that's so powerful to children to see when you can mobilise, you can work together, the kind of impact it can have on society. The children's sugar boycott, so towards the end of the 18th century, around 1791, and then again in the 1820s, we have the first consumer boycott. We've got lots of talk and conversation about boycotts today. It was a woman called Elizabeth Hayrick. She was a bit fed up with how slow Parliament was to change the state of what was going on. So she was part of advocating for the Quit Sugar campaign. And children were part of that. Children could see what was right or wrong, and they were part of boycotting that. Again, it's such a powerful way to talk to children about the way that they can use the power that they do have. So we talk in the marketing about, what does polishing your shoes have to do with slavery? So there were children who would refuse to get their shoes polished because polish had sugar in it. And if the sugar was from one of the plantations that was worked by enslaved people, they didn't want to use that. And this, in case you haven't seen it, was an extraordinary thing that I came across in my research, which was books for children showing them what slavery was all about, which I think is absolutely extraordinary that we can see this. And there are some critiques about, what was it like for people in England, and could they really talk about the experience of enslaved people? I have a different view. We have tradition and heritage to show children how the world is different and what those different stories can tell us. The story of slavery is, probably the darkest and most difficult chapter, but I have to say, this story of the home children was one that I hadn't come across before, and actually was very, very heartbreaking for me. So from the middle of the 19th century until recent living memory, children from Britain were sent to the colonies, and they were told to forget their heritage. And when they got to those places, and I tell the story of a little girl who's sent to Canada, she is not allowed to tell her story to her new family when she's there, and she is treated badly as an immigrant. And anytime she tries to raise what's happened to her, she's shut down. And I ask children, what does that tell us for the stories of immigrants that come to our country today? What would that girl tell us about the importance of knowing your story and connecting to her. One of the things that I wanted to show children the difference of is the difference when someone tells you a story about you and the way that you get to tell the story yourself. And that's part of the thread that I want to convey here to you. And these are two actual adverts that were actually in UK newspapers, selling children. A handsome black boy, about 13 years of age, very well qualified for making a household servant. This advertisement not to be repeated. And the second one, I apologise in advance for the language. Any person disposed to buy a Negro boy or girl, the boy about 14 years old. And we put those in the book because for me it's really important that children should see it firsthand. They need to be able to assess that evidence for themselves. But what happens when you actually show children the voices of people themselves, the stories that people get to tell about themselves rather than the ones that are told? This is from Mary Printer's memoir. And in response to somebody who says, you can read these yourselves, that slavery was not that bad and they were treated quite nicely. We still hear about that when people talk about plantations. I have been a slave myself, and the man that says slaves be quite happy in slavery, that they don't want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person. I have never heard a slave say so. The power of telling your own story, the power of giving a platform to somebody so they can describe themselves and their lives. These are the stories and the power that I wanted to convey to children so they could understand what it feels like. And I talk in the book about, 100 years ago, what it would have been like for children to learn about the British Empire. And actually one of the questions I posed to them and to you to think about is, what will children in 100 years from now say about the lives that we lived and what we are doing and how we're changing the world? Let me change tack slightly. So that's the power of telling your own story. But what about the power of you and your opinion? Because that's one of the hardest things that I think all of us struggle with, but particularly children. I'm a huge advocate. I like opinionated children who have lots of ideas about the world, and hopefully all of you do too. And one of the things that I realised, I have two girls, is that actually opinions about being a girl or a young child in the world are very difficult. If we see the rise of social media and the way that image is constructed for girls, but also increasingly for boys, I was really alarmed when the same World Cup girl, I feel like she's got like a starring role in this conversation. I just had my second child, and I'm not particularly body image conscious, but my clothes were not fitting quite the same as they used to, and I made a comment about this. She kind of looked at me very sternly, and she was like, "Mommy, you're very beautiful. Why are you saying that about yourself?" And I had this kind of mixed reaction of emotions. On the one hand, which was, "Go girl, this is great, like it's paying off," and a kind of worry about what happens when I'm not there to help her understand the world and to boost her confidence. And I think when I started to look at the conversations I have with children, and particularly around girls, it's very band-aid. It's very like, yeah, actually you are beautiful. It's very much about just reinforcing self-esteem. And what occurred to me is that actually it's much more powerful to give children the tools to decode the world themselves and to understand how we come to ideas so they can then decide for themselves. They don't have to have the same opinions as me or any of us, but they need to be able to understand how those ideas were created and whether they think they have any value. And so I wrote this book, Beautiful, also available in the bookshop, by the way. I don't know if you get a discount 2 for 1, but maybe. And what I wanted to get children to, and although it was written for girls, I've had a lot of parents of boys saying that they have also read it and the boys found it very, very useful, is that one of the most revolutionary things you can do is look in the mirror and feel happy with yourself. Because everything about the world we live in says that we shouldn't feel happy with who we are and what we look like. And so, the marketing for this was about starting a girl-powered revolution. This is the book. And one of the things that in forming an opinion, it's to understand who is shaping our opinion. So this is a little extract from some of the workshops that I was running for girls for schools, is to understand that our opinions don't necessarily come from a vacuum, and actually one of the most powerful things we can do is help children to decide what their opinion is and what has shaped it, and therefore be able to stand on their own and put the you into the way they see the world. So, in terms of beauty, There was a golden formula for deciding whether something was beautiful or not. Philosophers opined on whether, were women just, deformed men. We can go back to the Greeks and thank them for that. Who in art decided what was beautiful, and so on and so forth. And by showing children this and understanding that history and culture shape our opinions, and actually we can stand back for them and decide for themselves, the impact has been absolutely extraordinary. So one of the stories I tell, you can see these are some of the women featured in the book, is about Queen Elizabeth, who was a redhead. Well, before her, redheads were villains. They were evil witches. And along came Queen Elizabeth, and suddenly everybody wanted to have red hair, as my children tell me. Even the men wanted to have red beards, and they would kind of knock out their teeth because she had rotten teeth too. Just goes to show you can change the way that people talk about things with your opinion. And one of my favourite, I know this is a bit random, but this is one of my favourite facts which absolutely all the children really love, is that in pre-Islamic Arabia around the 5th and 6th century, if you wanted to tell a woman that she was very beautiful, the most, you can see where this is going, the most prized possession at that time for nomadic tribes was cows. And so if you wanted to compliment a woman, you would call her a cow. I do advise the children that's probably not wise to do. In terms of telling, giving people, children, the strength of their opinion, I tell them this story, and actually as adults I think it's instructive too, that the son is walking down the street, and the vampire says, "Oh gosh, you're horrible, aren't you? Just bring death and destruction wherever you go, nasty, miserable sunshine." Well, why does the vampire have that opinion? You have to judge an opinion by who's giving it to you, and then decide if you agree with it or not. And opinions are something that it's really important to decode if we're talking about power and politics and protest. This lovely gentleman, I put lovely in quotation marks, was Lord Cromer, and he was the British consul that ruled over Egypt. And one of his big pushes was that he was advocating that Muslim women in Egypt, because most Egyptian women are Muslim, should remove their headscarves as a sign of liberation and modernity. When Lord Cromer returned back to the UK in 1910, just as the suffragette and suffragist movements were rising, guess what he founded? An anti-suffragette movement. And so one of the really important things that I try to convey to children is to look behind what people are saying and their actions to discover what is really their opinion, and also what is their opinion about what is happening in the world. And maybe sometimes we see echoes of it. And finally, things are not always as they seem. Would you like an experiment? You would. There's no prizes for this one, by the way, sorry. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to look at the cross. Have any of you seen this before? Ooh, that's good. Right, look at the cross for about 20 seconds. We're going to be, you don't need to talk, we'll just have a look at that and then something will happen. What did you see when I changed it? Different colours, but these are all white. And what I wanted to convey to children and to all of us is that what's pre-existing in the conversation affects what we think about the way we see the world. And that's for images that affect how it distorts our view of things, but it also applies to opinion and conversation and narrative and story. And being able to allow children to step back from that, and ourselves, and to be able to look at the story again is, in my view, such a powerful tool that we can give to children. But you do need that explanation behind it to, in my view, to explain to children what's happening. I don't think they should take it at face value, because then our opinion is only worth what everybody else's is. So, children's power matters and how to give it to them. So I just wanted to share finally some things that I have learned during the process of becoming the author of Story of Now and writing for children. So the most important thing is to know your own stories and have good conversations. I sadly couldn't get a picture of all of you because it was too late by the time I got here. But this is the picture of the IBBY conference from 2019. What happens when some of those stories are missing. And this is, I also talk to children, we live in a very visual age, it's all about social media. What happens when that photograph is torn and we erase or eradicate or just simply miss out some of those stories? And what happens 100 years from now when there's nobody to advocate for those missing stories? We simply can't know what happened. But more importantly, one of the things that I really am such a strong advocate for is the collection of oral stories and empowering children and families to go away and talk about their own stories. The whole thread of my entire book is that the child's story is the most powerful gift that we can give that child, and the most powerful thing that that child can do for themselves. Because, even in the book I said I talk about kings and queens and historians and generals, because sometimes you just have to. But the stories that are not collected, the stories of our families, the story I went on my own journey to find out my own family story, which you'll see in a second, those are the most exciting stories, the most important stories for our children to gather for two reasons. One is, nobody has collected those stories. They are fresh, new stories that our children can gather. But more importantly, they are the stories that have shaped those children. It is their lives. And it's not easy to sit down in your families and ask, what happened to you? Granny, what did you live through? Those are not easy things when you're on the school run, or you're off to the supermarket, you're running between a party here and a play date over there. They're difficult things to do. But one of the things I do in the book is to give, this is really small writing, sorry about that. You can buy a book, did I mention? Is to give practical examples of things that can be done to not just to build those oral histories and collect them and give children and families power, but also, as an aside, to build those intergenerational relationships. And there are lots of studies on the site that talk about the benefits to both elderly people and children about intergenerational relationships. I'm a very nosy, curious person, so I ask people all the time about their stories, but I realise it's not easy. So things like, Granny, what was your favourite subject at school? What was the name of your school? What did you study? Were there any big things that happened at that time? What was the name of your best friend? And start to derive those details that come out. Really simple things you can do, and there are worksheets available to help children do that. And those stories help us to have really great conversations. And these are two examples from the recent news that I wanted to share about why knowing your story and understanding your place in the world can help to have better conversations, and better conversations lead to better societies. So on the one hand, you've heard of David Harewood, the incredible actor. He, in a documentary, said he went to visit the Harewood house, thought it was unusual that they both had the same name, but didn't think much of it until he discovered that it was the Earl of Harewood's family that had owned David Harewood's family. I mean, that's quite a huge thing. And what the Earl of Harewood has done is gone away to explore that, commissioned a portrait of David Harewood to sit in the family settings with all the other expensive works that they have. Really powerful conversation. There's also a new podcast that's come out with Laura Trevelyan, the ex-BBC journalist, called Heirs of Slavery, with Clive Lewis, talking about how her ancestors may well have owned the family of Clive Lewis's ancestors. That's the power of conversation. On the other hand, there was a Tory MP who was very upset that a PhD student in Cambridge had traced his own lineage and found that her family had likely been the slave owners of his family. Just a matter of historical record, and there was a huge fuss, you may recall, in the press about her wanting her and her family's name erased from that. That shows when conversations could be better. So actually, I also asked, what's the best biscuits to contain? Did you know that biscuits used to be savoury until sugar was much more common from the British Empire? So you can thank that for your hobnob. So what else did I learn from this story? Well, as I told you about the story of me not knowing anything about Edward Colston and the fact that there weren't any books about the British Empire, if you see a gap, fill it. And what I've learned over the years is if you think there's a gap, there probably is. This is my family story, which is perhaps a presentation for another day. We started in India, minding our own business, when the East India Company turned up in 1608. Then in the end of the 19th century, we went to Tanzania and East Africa, and then in the 60s, my parents came to London. And as an aside, two really interesting things I discovered as I was chatting to my dad, picking his brain, is that actually there was a good chance I would have been born and brought up in Zambia. And his £75 immigrant story was actually because he spent £75 going to Zambia to see if they could migrate there. Didn't work out, and so there was a £150 maximum cash limit out of Tanzania at the time, and that's why they ended up in London. Also separately, my mum, she was a seamstress. She used to have her own little shop in East Africa and Tanzania, and when she came to London, she actually worked for the designers like Vivienne Westwood in producing the haute couture of the time. And actually there are probably hundreds of thousands of women like my mum, she did haute couture, but who actually built the British fashion industry. We don't hear their stories at all. Because while Britain was in the 60s and 70s on King's Road and Chelsea, dominating the world's fashion, it was the women of the subcontinental heritage that were building that from behind. And those women were denigrated for not being fashionable, for being frumpy and fuddy-duddy. But if Britain is a fashion icon, it's because of those women who built it. That's a story that's very personal to me. Visual and written creativity. So one of the things that was really important in thinking about how to talk to children, as I said, children don't care about culture wars, they're not necessarily rooted in the past, was creating something that had a really striking visual identity that conveyed this fact of it's now and it's for the future, that felt contemporary, modern and relevant to children. And I can't tell you how beautiful is this cover. The art direction, the editor, and of course the illustrator, I think have done an absolutely phenomenal job of not using the jingoistic iconography, not making it feel like it's past, but making it feel contemporary, bold, and future-facing for children. If anyone wants to let the publishers know that they would like a fully illustrated version, please go ahead. Here are some of the internals that we did. And again, thinking about that kind of, written creativity, really kind of being playful with what it means, not kind of heavy and onerous and stuck in where grown-ups are in the conversation, but really thinking about what applies to the world that we live in. Anne's looking at me sternly like I'm near the end. I mentioned this before, for me, first-hand evidence is absolutely critical to giving children power. I don't believe they should take anything that we say at face value, not even what I tell them in the book. And I say that, it's up to them to decide, but I provide some questions and they can go away and think about it. And I have to say I'm so grateful to the publishers that they included this incredible photo insert in the book. And this is some of them, really beautiful, like, the Britannia receiving gifts, which is in the Foreign Office, really powerful image to discuss. And talking about the publishers and the editors, one thing I absolutely cannot emphasize enough is that the people that you work with need to have that bravery, need to have the creative as well as the societal courage to build that capital. And I cannot tell you how lucky I am with the publisher and the editor that I have been working with, in the way that they have given me the space to tell this story. As I said, I fell into children's writing very much accidentally, and it's a difficult subject to talk about. There are so many sensitivities, the bravery to publish a book about the empire. One of my friends left me a message yesterday saying, well done for standing up in the flow of the traffic when you can get knocked down, and I think that applies to the publishers and the editors, but also sales teams, librarians, people who can create that conversation is so utterly important. And also, a particular shout out, she's going to kill me, to my editor Gemma, who can answer any questions you want on the editorial process. One of the things actually that I noticed in this is that it's lovely as an author to get all the glory, but actually the editor, particularly for this conversation, is so powerful in the way that they shape the story and the space that they give you. And Gemma went away and researched her own story. It turns out Gemma is a nailing wench from Bromsgrove. And this is what she told me. I asked her what did she want to say to all of you. Listening to the stories of others, past and present, is something we must all do if we are to create a culture of understanding and empathy, because stories bind us to each other, and break down the barriers of time and culture. We need only a few words about the lives of another to stand with them and speak with them. To stand with them and speak with them. So I leave you with these thoughts, that knowing your story is power. And I know we're here talking about children, but that applies to each of us as well. We have to know our story to understand our place in the world and where our power comes from, so that we understand how best we can give it to children. Now, holding your own opinion is power. That conversation I took you through, who has shaped your opinion? How do you step back from it? And how do you hold your opinion? That's important for us. It's really important for children who are told that their opinions don't matter. They absolutely do. And as all the stories of the children I showed, sometimes those opinions of children, when we give them space, are the most powerful life and society changing of all. Expressing your voice is power. I told you I came to children's writing as an imposter. In advertising, it means, you know what, it doesn't matter, just imposter. Being an outsider can be a superpower, because you can see where the gap is and what needs to be changed. But the really important thing is to find your voice and to express it. And that's the power that we have.